On the afternoon of March 14th, 1991, a coastal radar station in southern Florida recorded something that would later appear in three separate internal aviation reports, none of which were ever made public. The object was tracked for 11 minutes across a section of airspace commonly used by commercial and private aircraft departing from Nassau and heading northwest toward Miami. It maintained a consistent altitude of 8,500 feet, traveled at approximately 340 knots, and followed what appeared to be a standard flight corridor. But when controllers attempted to establish radio contact, no one responded. When they checked the transponder code being transmitted, it returned a sequence that didn't match any filed flight plan for that day. And when the track was reviewed hours later, the data showed something even more difficult to explain. The aircraft had been logged entering controlled airspace at a position where no inbound flight had been recorded leaving it. To understand what that means, you have to go back 6 hours earlier, to the morning of the same day, and to a small regional airport on the western edge of Grand Bahama Island. The weather was clear, winds were light and variable. Visibility extended beyond 10 miles in every direction. It was the kind of morning when flying feels routine. A Beechcraft King Air 200, registration number N374PE, was scheduled to depart at 8:15 a.m. local time. The aircraft was owned by a private charter service based out of Fort Lauderdale and had been leased for a short-term cargo contract involving non-hazardous electronics and replacement parts for marine equipment. The flight plan was simple. Depart Grand Bahama, proceed northwest across open water, enter U.S. airspace near Bimini, and land at Fort Lauderdale Executive Airport by mid-morning. Total flight time was estimated at 1 hour and 12 minutes. The pilot in command was a man named Robert Veneman, age 47, with just over 9,000 hours of logged flight time. He had flown the Bahamas route more than 200 times. His co-pilot, Michael Ruiz, was younger, less experienced, but fully qualified on the King Air. Both men had completed their pre-flight checks without incident. Fuel load was confirmed at full capacity. Weight and balance were within normal limits. The aircraft's avionics had been inspected 3 days prior, and no maintenance issues were noted in the logbook. At 8:22 a.m., N374PE was cleared for takeoff. The tower controller at Grand Bahama logged the departure and handed the flight off to Nassau Center, which would monitor the aircraft as it crossed into international airspace. Veneman acknowledged the handoff. His voice was calm, professional. Everything about the flight, up to that point, was unremarkable. Nassau Center tracked the King Air as it climbed to its assigned altitude of 8,500 feet and turned onto a heading of 310 degrees. The aircraft was visible on radar. Its transponder was transmitting the correct squawk code. There was no indication of any technical problem. At 8:41 a.m., the controller radioed the aircraft with a routine position update. Veneman responded immediately. His transmission was clear. He confirmed his heading, altitude, and estimated time to the boundary of U.S. airspace. That was the last communication Nassau Center received from N374PE. At 8:56 a.m., the controller attempted to raise the aircraft again. There was no response. He tried twice more over the next 3 minutes. Still nothing. At that point, standard procedure would have been to declare a communications failure and alert nearby aircraft. But the controller didn't do that. Because the radar track was still there. The transponder was still transmitting. The aircraft was still flying. He made a note in the log and continued monitoring. At 9:03 a.m., the radar return from N374PE faded. Not suddenly, the way it would if the aircraft had descended below coverage or suffered a catastrophic failure. It faded gradually, the way a signal does when it moves out of range. The controller assumed the aircraft had entered U.S. airspace and was now being tracked by Miami Center. He closed the flight strip and moved on. But Miami Center never picked up N374PE. There was no handoff, no radio call, no transponder code matching the flight plan filed that morning. When controllers in Miami reviewed their logs later that day, there was no record of the King Air entering their airspace at all. For the next several hours, no one noticed. The charter company in Fort Lauderdale wasn't expecting the aircraft until late morning. The crew hadn't filed an ETA with dispatch. And because the flight had been logged as departed by Nassau Center and closed out of their system, there was no automatic flag to indicate a problem. It wasn't until after 2 p.m., when the client in Fort Lauderdale called to ask where their shipment was, that anyone realized the aircraft hadn't arrived. The company contacted Fort Lauderdale executive. The airport had no record of the King Air landing. They checked with Miami Center. No record there either. They called Nassau. Nassau confirmed the departure and the last known position, but said the flight had left their airspace hours ago. At that point, a search coordinator was notified. The U.S. Coast Guard was alerted. Aircraft in the area were asked to keep watch for debris, life rafts, or emergency beacons. The search zone was defined as a corridor extending from Grand Bahama to the edge of U.S. airspace, roughly 120 miles of open water. But before the search could be fully mobilized, something else happened. At 3:17 p.m., a radar station near Homestead, Florida, logged an unidentified aircraft traveling northwest at 8,500 feet. The target had no associated flight plan. The transponder code it was transmitting didn't match anything in the system. Controllers tried to make contact. There was no response. The target continued on course for 11 minutes, then disappeared from radar at 3:28 p.m., approximately 40 miles southeast of Miami. The incident was logged as a possible aircraft with inoperative radio. A review was scheduled for the following day. But when that review took place, the technician who pulled the radar data noticed something irregular. The transponder code being transmitted by the unknown aircraft was identical to the one assigned to N374PE that morning. That detail was flagged immediately. A second analyst was brought in to verify the data. Both confirmed the match. The aircraft tracked by Homestead radar at 3:17 p.m. was squawking the same 4-digit code that had been issued to the King Air more than 6 hours earlier. A meeting was convened. Representatives from the FAA, the Coast Guard, and the National Transportation Safety Board reviewed the timeline. They compared the departure log from Nassau, the radar track from Homestead, and the radio transcripts from both facilities. The conclusion was straightforward. The aircraft tracked over Homestead was N374PE. It had to be. The transponder code was a direct match. But that conclusion created a new problem. If the radar contact at 3:17 p.m. was the King Air, then where had it been for the previous 6.5 hours? The distance from Grand Bahama to the point where the radar return faded near Nassau was approximately 65 nautical miles. At the speed the King Air had been traveling, that distance should have taken about 12 minutes to cover. The aircraft had been in contact with Nassau Center until 8:41 a.m. and had disappeared from their radar at 9:03 a.m. That timeline fit, but the aircraft had reappeared on radar near Homestead at 3:17 p.m., more than 6 hours later, at a position that should have taken no more than 70 minutes to reach from its point of departure. There was no flight plan modification, no landing at an intermediate airport, no distress call, no indication the aircraft had deviated from its original route. And yet the King Air had somehow been in the air for more than 7 hours on a flight that should have taken just over 1. The fuel capacity of a Beechcraft King Air 200 is 544 gallons. At normal cruise settings, the aircraft burns approximately 90 gallons per hour. That gives it a maximum endurance of just over 6 hours, assuming no reserve. If N374PE had departed Grand Bahama at 8:22 a.m. and had been continuously airborne until 3:17 p.m., it would have been flying for 6 hours and 55 minutes. That would have required more fuel than the aircraft could carry. The NTSB requested maintenance records. They wanted to verify the fuel load at departure. The records showed that the aircraft had been serviced the night before and that the tanks had been topped off. There was no indication that additional fuel had been loaded. The weight and balance sheet submitted with the flight plan confirmed a standard fuel load. If that was accurate, the King Air should have run out of fuel somewhere over the Atlantic, hours before it appeared on radar near Homestead. But the radar data was clear. The aircraft had been tracked. Its altitude, speed, and heading were all consistent with normal flight. There was no indication of engine failure, no descent, no deviation. The aircraft had been flying under power. One possible explanation was that the radar data was wrong, that the transponder code had been duplicated, either by error or malfunction, and that the aircraft tracked at 3:17 p.m. was not the King Air. The FAA opened an investigation into transponder code assignments for that day. They checked every flight plan filed within a 200-mile radius of southern Florida. Not one of them had been assigned the same code as N374PE. They checked for possible signal interference, equipment malfunction, or data corruption. None of those factors were present. The radar station near Homestead had been operating normally. The transponder return had been strong and consistent. There was no technical reason to doubt the accuracy of the track. Another possibility was that the aircraft had landed somewhere between Nassau and Homestead, refueled, and taken off again without filing a flight plan. The NTSB contacted airports throughout the Bahamas and southern Florida. None of them had any record of the King Air landing that day. They checked private airstrips. They checked offshore platforms with helicopter pads. They even contacted the Bahamian Defense Force to see if the aircraft had been spotted at any uncontrolled fields. Nothing. And even if the aircraft had landed and refueled, it didn't explain the radio silence. It didn't explain why the crew never contacted air traffic control. It didn't explain why the transponder had stopped transmitting to Nassau, but had reappeared hours later near Homestead without any indication of an intermediate position. On March 17th, 3 days after the incident, the Coast Guard suspended active search operations. No wreckage had been found. No emergency beacon had been detected. No debris had washed ashore. The search area had been expanded twice, covering more than 4,000 square miles of ocean. There was no evidence that the aircraft had gone down, but there was also no evidence that it had landed. The file was transferred to the NTSB's Incident Review Board. They classified it as an unresolved disappearance pending further information. The charter company submitted an insurance claim. The families of the 2 pilots were notified that the crew was missing and presumed lost, but no official determination was made. The case remained open. In the months that followed, several theories were proposed. Some investigators believed the aircraft had suffered a gradual electrical failure that disabled the radio but left the transponder intermittently functional. That might explain the loss of communication and the gaps in radar coverage. But it didn't explain the 6-hour delay. And it didn't explain how the aircraft could have remained airborne without sufficient fuel. Others suggested the crew had intentionally disabled the radio and diverted the flight for reasons unknown. Smuggling was considered, so was theft. But the cargo manifest showed nothing of significant value. The electronics being transported were worth less than $12,000. And both pilots had clean records. There was no evidence of financial trouble, criminal association, or any motive to disappear. A third explanation focused on navigation error. It was theorized that the crew might have become disoriented and flown in the wrong direction, possibly circling back over the Atlantic before eventually turning toward Florida. That would account for the extended flight time. But it didn't account for the fuel. And it didn't explain why the aircraft had reappeared on radar at a position almost perfectly aligned with its original flight path. In 1993, 2 years after the incident, a retired air traffic controller who had worked at Nassau Center during the early 1990s gave an interview to a private aviation journal. He was not named in the article, but he claimed to have been the controller on duty the morning of March 14, 1991. According to his account, the radar return from N374PE had not simply faded, it had vanished. One moment the aircraft was there, the next moment it wasn't. He said the disappearance had been instantaneous, and that he had assumed at the time that the radar equipment had malfunctioned. He also said that he had reported the incident to his supervisor immediately, and that the supervisor had told him to log it as a normal handoff and not to mention the sudden disappearance. When asked why, the supervisor had reportedly said that unexplained radar events over that part of the ocean were not uncommon, and that making a formal report would only lead to paperwork and scrutiny that wouldn't change anything. The journal that published the interview was small, regional, and focused primarily on Caribbean aviation. The article generated little attention. No follow-up investigation was conducted. The FAA did not comment. Neither did the NTSB. In 1998, a fisherman operating out of Andros Island reported finding a piece of aircraft debris washed up on a remote stretch of beach. The debris was a section of wing skin, approximately 4 feet long, with faded paint and no visible registration markings. He turned it over to local authorities, who forwarded it to the Bahamian Civil Aviation Department. A preliminary inspection suggested the debris was consistent with a twin-engine turboprop, possibly a King Air or similar model. But the metal was heavily corroded, and no serial numbers could be recovered. The debris was cataloged and stored. No definitive link to N374PE was ever established. In 2003, a private investigator hired by one of the families requested access to the radar data from March 14, 1991. The request was denied. The FAA stated that the data had been archived and was no longer readily available. When the investigator pressed further, he was told that the specific tapes from that day had been recorded over in accordance with standard data retention policies. No backup copies existed. The investigator also attempted to obtain the radio transcripts from Nassau Center. He was told that those records had been transferred to a regional archive in 1995 and that the archive had suffered water damage during a hurricane 2 years later. The transcripts from March 1991 were listed as lost. In 2011, 20 years after the incident, A documentary filmmaker contacted several former employees of the charter company in Fort Lauderdale. One of them, a dispatcher who had worked there in the early 1990s, said that the company had received a call 2 weeks after the disappearance from someone claiming to be Robert Veneman. The caller had said very little. He had asked if the aircraft had been found. When told that it had not, he had hung up. The dispatcher reported the call to the company owner, who reported it to the FAA. The call was investigated, but the origin could not be traced. It had come from a payphone in North Carolina. No further contact was ever made. The dispatcher said that the voice on the call had sounded strained, distant, and uncertain. She couldn't say with confidence whether it had really been Veneman, but she also couldn't say that it wasn't. No other confirmed sightings of the crew were ever reported. No wreckage was ever positively identified. No bodies were ever recovered. The official NTSB file remains open but inactive. The incident is listed as an unexplained disappearance of a charter aircraft over the Western Atlantic. The probable cause section of the report is blank, but the radar data still exists in at least one location. In 2017, a researcher working on a separate project related to air traffic control in the 1990s came across a reference to the March 14, 1991 incident in a set of internal FAA memos that had been declassified as part of a routine records release. The memos did not contain the radar data itself, but they referenced a secondary review that had been conducted in April of 1991. That review had been classified as inconclusive, but one of the memos included a handwritten note in the margin. The note read, "Track confirmed, timing unexplained, recommend no public statement." The researcher attempted to obtain the full review. He was told that it had never been formally published and that no copies were available. What is known from the documents that do exist is that the aircraft tracked by Homestead radar on the afternoon of March 14, 1991, was transmitting a transponder code that had been assigned to only one flight that day. That flight had departed more than 6 hours earlier. It had been out of contact for the entire duration. It had reappeared in a position consistent with its original flight path, traveling at normal speed and altitude as though no time had passed at all. And then it had disappeared again. There is no official explanation. There is no evidence of equipment failure. There is no proof of deliberate deviation. There is only the data. And the data shows that for 11 minutes on a clear afternoon in March, something was flying through controlled airspace near the southern coast of Florida that should not have been there, or should not have been there yet. If you follow aviation mysteries and unexplained incidents, subscribe for future investigations.